All right, so now that we've formed our teams and are hopefully starting our agile team meetings and hopefully been ramped up on collaborative coding on GitHub, we're going to talk a little bit about coding best practices. But before I dive deep into that, I do want to go through a few questions from last week. First, if you want the GitHub pages to work, you have to make sure that the repository is actually named whatever your username is .github.io. And this mostly applies to the whoever is housing the repository, so that team lead. And then if you've done that, you can actually enter the username.github.io into your browser and it will show up as a web page. So that's where the magic is there. So if you didn't have your repository named this specific name, you can still push code to it, but the GitHub pages part where you can view it as a website won't work. So that's just something you need to make sure that you're doing right. If any changes are not pushing, so if they look good on your computer, and then when you push them, nothing changes on the repository, make sure that you check your branch. And then also on GitHub, you might want to check whether or not there's any pull requests that have been generated by your push. Sometimes if you push onto a different branch, you actually have to go into that pull requests tab and then merge that change in. Mary, you have a question?
Yeah. So what if you have multiple like codes you're working on, like multiple scripts? How does that work when you go to the web, like the github.io? How does that work? How does it prioritize if you have multiple codes going on, like multiple HTMLs, for example, like you're playing around with layouts of different layouts and you're getting feedback and you're collaborating? How do you know which one's going to pop up when you go to that link?
So when you say multiple codes, do you mean multiple files, multiple
Multiple
repositories?
files in the
Okay.
same repository.
So that's good. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually a good practice would be to use multiple files. And we'll probably get into this a little bit today. You can use a different file to represent a different web page. So let's say that you have your main or index.html. That can be, let's call it your home page. You could also have a page called About Us or something like that, and then just call it About Us.html. That's perfectly legitimate. And in fact, it's recommended because remember from last lecture, one of the problems that I mentioned might happen is if multiple people are working on the same file at the same time, you might have conflicts, right? So let's say that I'm working on index and Mary's also working on index, and we both change the title, then GitHub isn't going to know which one to keep. So that then you're going to have to resolve that through a pull request and decide what you want to keep, what you don't. So it's a really good practice for people to work on different files because that avoids having conflicts. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but it's more like when, because it should be the same github.io link for everything in the repository. I'm just not sure how it knows which one to display.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that'll become more clear after this lecture, but essentially it's going to default to the index.html, but then within that index.html, you could actually link to other HTML files. And we'll go through that. So you all probably remember in your HTML learning that there's the A elements that come with an href that can lead to some sort of link. You can have that href actually lead to a different HTML file. And so that will enable you then to have multiple different files. And while the GitHub pages will default to index, if you click a button that links to, let's say, about us.html, then it will direct the page to go to that file. So that will enable you to see different files within a single web page, right? And that's sort of reflecting what a page actually is, which is several different HTML files that are in some sort of site map, right? So you start with the home page, but then if you click a few clicks deep in, you might get to a completely different type of page. And again, we'll show that in practice, that it's not just me telling, it verbally how it works, so that you can really see how that's going to look.
If we have time, could I ask one more question about the
Sure.
github.io? So when I tried it multiple times. I tried it with my username, without, and I still get the same 404 error no matter what.
Mhm.
And like my team has our basic HTML script already. We have a couple versions of it already, and it's not displaying anything. It's just this 404 error.
Okay, so that's something that we could maybe go through when we do the team breakouts. Yeah, so we'll midway through the lecture, we'll break out into teams again. And at that point, I can hop through the different breakout rooms and answer any questions. Okay, and then related to what we were just talking about, hey, Christian, would you mind muting? Thank you. So
I'm sorry.
yeah, no problem. So related to what we were talking about working with different files, make sure before you start working on your code that you pull. So on your Visual Studio Code, there's a way to pull on the Git panel, and I'll show you all to remind you when I get into the coding part of this lecture. But make sure you pull so that you know that you have your code aligned with whatever's on GitHub. And that's going to make sure that you all are aligned so that there's no conflicts. Okay. And I see Morgan's team is also having the same problem. So it would probably help me to actually see your code. So we can go through that after the break. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about user testing. Any volunteers would like to talk about what technique you think would be best for your project? And there are no right or wrong answers here. I just want to hear your thought process. Mary?
So I'm on the period tracker project, and it's all about giving back to women who have PCOS. So I chose concurrent thinking out loud because I feel that it really will help us understand what's satisfying and dissatisfying the users, and also engaging them in a dialogue so they're not just going through it alone. If they have any questions midway, we can resolve that, because maybe it's something, maybe they're just interacting with the web page incorrectly and they need some troubleshooting, and it's not like a negative thing about it. And then I've noticed when I'm personally thinking out loud while I'm doing something, I'm reflecting and able to give a better answer. And although the con is that it may interfere with metrics like accuracy and time on tasks, but the amount that you would save in the long run, I feel outweighs that negative aspect in my case, or my team's case.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. One area in which concurrent think aloud really works well is if you're trying to appeal to a very broad audience and you want to make sure that your application is as user friendly as possible, right? And sometimes when we go retrospective, people will say, oh yeah, that makes sense, but maybe it didn't make sense to them at the time. And the reality is that a lot of users, they're intolerant of confusion, right? And so if you download an app and it's confusing off the bat, then you might just stop using it. So with the concurrent think aloud method, it helps tease that out in real time. So you can really see what their thought process is as they go to each page, and whether they're really understanding your intention. Anyone else with concurrent think aloud? I think that was probably the most popular among the answers. Jiao?
Yeah, so I'm in the group of IDAD. So we're targeting elderly peoples or with Alzheimer's disease and such. So I would say that we also use the CTA is because that oftentimes they are slow. So if there's something not like smooth enough, they may not like complete a full session. So we absolutely need to. I think we absolutely need to follow the process and every step and each action where they are doing. So yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great answer. Okay. Any others for concurrent think aloud? How about concurrent probing? I think there were less with this, but there were a couple. Kristen, I know that you said concurrent think aloud, but also concurrent probing. You want to talk a little bit about why you chose concurrent probing as well?
Yes, I talk about the concurrent probing because I would like to ask or to interact in the same time when the user are testing our product or our software to learn more about their feelings that that, that they cannot express by words. I don't know, it's okay.
Yeah, for sure. And I think concurrent probing can really be good at the beginning stage of a project as well, right? Concurrent think aloud is really good once you sort of know what you've got and you want to try to make smaller improvements to make it more user friendly. Concurrent probing might be where you still have a ton of questions. You don't have a lot of answers and you want to understand how they're interacting with your product. Jeanette, I know you did concurrent probing as well and you got your hand up.
Yeah, I chose concurrent probing because I was kind of thinking of it like you will, where since it's like really early on in the product, I didn't think concurrent think aloud would be the best option because I was thinking there would be a hard way to distinguish between whether we're just asking questions or whether we're kind of leading them to like the right answer with having them think aloud. So I wanted to just choose, like, I didn't want to have to interfere with their process as much, which was why I chose probing, because I felt like we could be more strategic in the types of questions we were asking to help kind of avoid some of the usability metrics like interfering with that aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's a delicate balance between think aloud and probing, because on the one hand, especially at your stage, there's going to be a lot of problems. And so trying to tease through what's just something where you need to put a little bit more work into it versus trying to get a good overall strategic guidance as to what the application needs to look like. It can be tough to tease out at such an early stage. But at the same time, if you are going to go probing, you do have to be very careful not to lead them in a direction where you think it should go. Right. So that's, if you all choose probing, which I think would be a great option, just try to figure out how can you be as unbiased in your questioning as possible so that the users are still the ones who are giving you the answers and you're not feeding the answers to them, because ultimately your users, they want to please, right? They aim to please. And if they get a sense that you're heading in a certain direction, they'll say, oh yeah, that's a great way to go. And that's the part that you want to avoid if you're probing, is feeding them the answers, because the users are, as we learned through our lean understanding and our agile learning, the users are the best source of information that you can get. So keeping that source pure can be difficult, but very rewarding if you do it right. How about the retrospectives? We got a lot of those. Who chose a retrospective think aloud or a retrospective probing? Tyler.
I thought the retrospectives were really good because that way the actual user isn't being like influenced or interrupted in their thought processes and their genuine actions. So I also saw that the video recording is also provided after the fact, so that user can kind of recall what they were doing, and I think that is enough to show to sort of jog the memory a little bit and kind of describe the thought processes while they use the software or web page.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned video, because video can be very powerful, really with both, but particularly with retrospective, because sometimes what you lose with concurrent think aloud, or if you're not doing that, you can regain just by looking at the video. You can sort of see the big thing that you missed when you go retrospective is you sort of, everyone forgets when they were confused unless they were like really, really confused. And so by having the video, you can get a sense for, oh, you know, they took too long to finish that. They must have been confused. And then, you know, one, where to work from, but then also some of the follow-up questions to ask. And sometimes you can show them the video back so that they're watching their process and they can re-inhabit their thought process. Anyone else with the retrospectives? I tended to see more with the people who chose retrospective. I tended to see more retrospective probing than think aloud. Anyone who chose probing like to talk about why they leaned more towards probing than think aloud? Lynn, I see you chose retrospective probing. Would you like to
Yes,
talk about that?
yes. I was on the same project with Janet as well, but then I was thinking that for retrospective, like you can ask it after the test is done, so then you're not interfering with their thought process. Because when thinking out loud, like I kind of feel that, oh, you might giving them like a direction for them to like pass the test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
that go ahead.
And for retrospective, I was thinking that like after the test, like we can like, since we might like they might forget what the data is, and they might forget what their thought process when they're doing the test. I was thinking of like after the test, we actually bring out the data and then go over each question and see like, oh, and asking question and see like why they think or like why they doing that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great way if you're going to go retrospective to put something in front of them, whether that be video or numbers, or maybe even just your notes. And you could say, hey, I noticed that you slowed down here. Do you want to talk about that? And that can also, like I was saying before, enable them to inhabit the mindset that they had while they were using it. So thanks so much. That was very helpful. Maria, you also chose retrospective probing. Would you like to talk about that? Okay, how about the retrospective think alouds? There are a few of those. Alexa, I know that you chose concurrent think aloud and retrospective think aloud. Would you like to talk maybe a little bit about your choice with retrospective think aloud?
Sure. For retrospective think aloud, I was thinking that it could help with seeing what patients got out of their experience with the app, since it's sort of like for at least for the recovery side, do they feel comforted, you know? So it's sort of like, what is the general sense they get at the end? and just thinking about what things stood out to them.
Yeah, that's good. And I like, in that sense, it's good to keep it a little bit open-ended, because you just want to get a sense for, what did they think throughout the process? What did they think they were working with, right? How did they think that this app would serve them? And that's a good way to figure out. Maybe you're trying to choose between a few features, and rather than just asking them straight up, which feature do you like better, you can get a sense based on what their thought process was, which direction they would like to see you go. So it's a good way to get the answers from them without having to ask and potentially risk biasing them. So I think moral of the story is that there really is no wrong way to go about user testing. There are some wrong tactics to use, but strategically, you could go with any of these 4 options and you could do well. Just make sure that you understand the pitfalls of each, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the ensuing slides. Would anyone else, before I move on, like to talk about their answer? Good chance for participation. Yes, Maria.
Yeah, sorry about before. So the reason that I chose the retrospective one, is because like we don't have like a super complex app, but you definitely like need to be concentrated while you're doing things. So that's why I choose like to do the things after you do everything. And also like after doing follow-up questions, you can like get more variables to make your app better. Yeah, that was like my reasoning after.
Yep, that's definitely a good point. Sometimes you just really want them focused. You don't want them to be distracted. And sometimes that can be the determination of whether you go concurrent or retrospective. Okay, great. So moving forward, this is just one thing that I wanted to emphasize, is that there have been some studies on how many people does it take to really satisfy user testing requirements. And what we found is that once you get to about 5 people, you've really gotten the majority of the feedback that you need. And it becomes diminishing returns. It's still, the more people, the better off you're going to be. But people start to contradict each other. They start saying the same thing. So if you want to get the majority of the issues with your app uncovered, or the majority of the good feedback that you could receive, you really need about 5 people. One thing that they emphasized, and this would be great extra credit for you all if you do, but not necessarily required, is if you can do multiple rounds. So you can show it to them maybe at the beginning, and then you can show the application after you've incorporated their feedback. That can be very helpful to making sure that you actually addressed whatever concerns or interests that they might have for the development of your application. And yeah, so essentially, anyone can really help finding any UX issues, but there are some issues that can only be observed by watching your target audience. So that's just something to keep in mind. My recommendation for your cohort of people to do user testing is to choose 3 or 4 of your fellow students, just because that's easy and you can help each other out in that realm. And then try to find at least 1 or 2 if you really find that your demographic, you've got a good handle on it, of the people that you're actually trying to get to use the app. If you're trying to go for, let's say, Alzheimer's as an example, you don't necessarily have to get someone with Alzheimer's, but maybe someone at least in that age bracket would be a good person to go for, right? So just try to have someone who's maybe a little bit closer to your target audience than your fellow student. If your application actually, like the period tracker, could be for any female, then that's great. So you could go for your fellow female students. But you might also find that it's helpful to choose a slightly different age range, maybe someone who's younger and just starting their periods, or someone who is older, right? Because different ages are going to have different issues. So that's just something to keep in mind, is I think the majority of your users are going to be able to find whatever they need to find, whatever you need to know about your usability of your app. But it's also good to get some observations from someone who's a little bit closer to your target audience. Any questions about that? So going through the user testing methods, we talked a little bit about concurrent and retrospective, but the main principle is that with concurrent, the users are sharing their thoughts while they are actually doing the testing. The benefit is that thoughts are captured while they're truly fresh, and that's really a really big benefit. However, the actual act of talking might interfere with their ability to engage sufficiently with the app. So there's of course a trade-off. And then retrospective means that they're really using the app the way that is intended, but they might not remember where they had problems, what they did like, what they didn't like. And it's just a constant tug of war. If you want, you could use multiple methods during your user testing. You don't have to commit to one method, and then you can see which one you like better. So this graphic is just showing how you could record. You could also have observers that are not seen. You generally are going to need a moderator, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the moderator does. And then they can choose to either think quietly, but in this case, they're thinking aloud. So this would be CTA, right? So some techniques, I've got this link for you. This is a great link for test scripts of what you can use to develop what you're going to tell your subject as a lead up to the user testing. That lead up is pretty important because you want to set the stage, but you also don't want to lead them too much. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. You don't necessarily want opinions. What you want is areas for improvement. So they're really, when you're dealing with users, some people might have a ton of opinions. Some of them might be great, but what you're looking for is commonalities of where users are stumbling and what therefore you might need to fix in order to get your app to work right. So the opinions are fine, but what you're really looking for is to observe feedback on the app, either by seeing how they use it, seeing where they stumble a little bit, or through them telling you where they might have been confused or where they thought a button was going to do one thing, but instead it did another. Make sure that you set the stage for the user. You really need to not only give them sort of, this is a setting, you are a Alzheimer's patient, blah, 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 but don't guide them too much. Over moderating is really the #1 way that people can screw this up. So ask very vague questions like, well, what do you think? They're going to be tempted to ask you questions during the user testing, like, oh, what does this do? But you're not going to be there to answer that question for all the users that you have when the app is actually out there in public. So don't give them more than other users are going to have. Try to throw a question back at their question wherever possible. And then finally, make sure that you compare the user's subjective rating against performance metrics. So they might think that, oh, this was easy, or they're telling you that everything was easy. But if they really struggled on a certain page, that's something that you might want to probe into because it might be a sign that they were confused, even if they either forgot about that or don't want to admit it. So an example test section, you would start with welcoming the user. And it's helpful here, and you'll see this in the scripts in the link from the last slide, that it helps to just tell them what you're doing. So you can explain, this is a concurrent think aloud. So I would like you to really speak your thoughts out loud as we go through this testing, or whatever the technique might be, to explain what the expectation is from them. And then set the stage for what's going on, but don't really divulge too much about what they're going to need to do. That's something they need to figure out on their own. And then you ask some demographic questions, just get a sense for, who is this user? Where do they fit within my cohort? Are they a typical user, or are they just someone who's here to help uncover bugs. Then establishing the setting. So we've talked about the type of testing and what they should expect, but now it's time to tell them who they are, what the context is, why they're even using this app in the first place, because obviously they are using your app under unnatural circumstances. It's not like they have a need and they found your application through some sales or marketing that you did. Instead, they're doing user testing. So you need to really give them a sense for why they would be using it so that you can put them in the right mindset. And then once they start the task, ensure that they're thinking aloud. If they go silent for a little bit too long and you're doing concurrent think aloud, it's not probing to say, well, what are you thinking right now, right? If you're probing, then you might actually be asking more pointed questions about like, what do you think the purpose of this button is, right? But if you're doing concurrent think aloud, it might be more along the lines of, well, what are you thinking? Right. So if they start to pause a little bit, they say, then that's a great point. If they're not coming out with their thoughts, for you to interject in and just ask them, hey, what are your thoughts? You can also note user behavior, any comments, any errors that they made, as well as tasks that they're able to successfully complete. Finally, at the end, it is always very helpful to debrief. So at this point, you want to dive deep into the notes that you've taken or the notes that maybe your partner has taken, and then ask them, what are their thoughts on your notes? So this is a very important point because it helps consolidate everything that you need to know, or every thought that they might have had at a given point in time while using your app. And you're really just trying to get all of the knowledge possible. And there's a certain order sometimes that you do it too, right? So you don't really want to talk about your notes concurrently, right? That's more of a retrospective thing so that you're able to keep, while they're using the app, a little bit more pure. Now, of course, if you're using concurrent probing, you would still ask them probing questions, but it might not be about the notes that you took. So in this case, this example test session, you can see that there's a little bit of different techniques used, right? So this, what were you thinking right now? That's a little bit more concurrent think aloud. But then this debrief where you're diving into the notes from the task, this is a little bit more retrospective probing. So it is possible to combine different techniques into a single session. So I created this playbook in order to help a little bit with how to respond when a given scenario occurs within a user testing. So if you're not really sure what the user is thinking, you could ask, hey, what are you thinking? Right? Simple as that. What are you looking at, or what are you doing now? So these are very broad questions that are not leading them in any direction, but they're eliciting a response from the user. If you see, and this will happen often, I think, when they click a button, they go, oh, or then that's a good point to interject and just say, is this what you expected to happen? So this is a nice, again, broad question that will get good information from them without biasing them in any direction. If the user is probing you, which this happens a lot, if they say, oh, should I click this button now? Or should I use this form or something like that? This is where it's good for you to respond with a question. So you could say, well, what would you do if I wasn't here? Or, well, why don't you go ahead and try it? Or, I didn't put it here, but what do you think? Or I'd like you to do whatever you would normally do. So if they're fishing for clues, try to avoid giving them the answer if at all possible. Try to throw a question back at them. And then that's a win-win because you're going to get more information from them answering the question without tainting the experience of the user testing. This one right here, I would really, of all the playbook items, I'd encourage you to focus in on this one because this is, I think, where people are most likely to fall into the trap of being an over moderator. Because of course they're asking for information. Why wouldn't you give it to them? but just try to resist that if at all possible, because it's going to be natural because you're right there with them for them to ask questions that they wouldn't normally be able to ask as a regular user. If they make a comment and you don't know really what triggered the comment, so you're not sure where they're coming from, that's a good point to interject and ask them, well, was there something in particular that made you think of that? And that can give you a clue as to maybe what parts of your page might be leading or misleading them to think a certain thing. If they suggest that they're concerned that they're not really giving you the information that you need, they might be insecure about their ability to give you proper user testing feedback. Just try to encourage them. Say, no, this is very helpful. This is exactly what we need. Because you want to help them get past that insecurity that they're not being a good user tester. Because let's be honest, pretty much everyone that you user test with has never done it before. So that this is going to be new to them, new to you. So it's okay for them to not necessarily feel comfortable in this situation. And then your job is to help them become more comfortable. If the user asks you to explain how something works, so this is similar to the third row, like, well, do I receive a result immediately, or what will happen when I submit? Again, throw it back at them. Say, well, how do you think it would work? Or I can't answer that right now because we need to know what you would do when I'm not here to answer questions for you, but I can give you an answer when we are finished. So this is a good way for, like, you really want to help them, you really want to give them the answer, but you know it's not appropriate. You can just always defer to, kind of like I've done already in this lecture, where there's a question, I say, well, we'll talk about that in a later slide. So you can pull that same move and tell them, well, we can talk about that during the debrief, but for now, I'd like you to experience it as if I weren't here. Okay, if the user seems distracted, or and this will happen too, where maybe you expected them to use a certain tool that you built in the app, but they're just like hanging out in the about us, and they're really interested in that, but it really has nothing to do with your app. Then you can ask, well, what are you trying to do now? And that can help push them in the direction of being more on task. But that's also a clue, right? If they're distracted by something that's not core to your app, maybe you shouldn't have that thing. Or maybe you can still keep it, but maybe the button that takes you to whatever that distraction page is a little bit more low key. Maybe it's in the footer or something like that instead of being right up front. Any questions about the playbook? This all kind of makes sense. You all feel confident that you could do a user testing and not bias them in any way? All right, any questions? So we'll move on a little bit to user experience, sort of front end best practices. So talk a little bit about visual hierarchy with layouts, and there's an F pattern versus a Z pattern, as well as color. So choosing a consistent color palette, contrasting light and dark colors versus warm and cold colors, typography, and then spacing. So with F patterns versus Z patterns, an F pattern is essentially the most appropriate when a user has, or a web page, sorry, has a lot of content. So you will have noticed this in maybe a blog where you have a lot of information, maybe at the top, and then it's sort of, you're just reading left to right, going down, left to right, and then going down. And it's a little bit more front loaded. That's why it's an F instead of an E. And this is really, it's a technique to control the user journey. So you want to make sure that they're reading all of the material in a way that is easy on their eyes, and you're not making them sort of jet around the page from the upper part to the lower part, back up, and so on and so forth. So it's giving them a nice predictable pattern to consume all the content that you have on your page. A Z pattern is more with a minimalist design. So here, maybe there's one or two lines, you're not having them read paragraphs, and essentially they're going left to right at the beginning because that's where you're telling them what this page is about. But then they're sort of jetting down, maybe observing an image or something, and then going down to the bottom, and then that should lead them to a call to action. So here's an example of an F and Z pattern. So with this website, there's a lot of material that they want you to read, and you can see that it's a little bit like an F, right? So it starts out going all the way across the page at the beginning. This is sort of the big, let's get the user hooked. And then as they keep reading, they become a little bit shorter until they get to the bottom, right? Facebook homepage, this is a good example of a Z pattern where you have the main content of what they want you to do to get started, to log in, and then you sort of jet back to, okay, here's on the left middle a little bit of something to read, and then that leads to the end of the Z of the call to action. So then sign up, right? Okay, color theory. So in front end, a lot of the times they'll use these color wheels, which is essentially, it's sort of these colors that are ordered by their frequency. So it's kind of how you'll see like a marker or crayon box is organized. And the idea is that you can direct the user's attention more with warm colors, and then high contrast text will also draw the user's eye. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But another thing with this wheel is that there's several different ways that you can approach it. You can either choose complementary colors. So let's say like this orange, red, violet at top. So it's sort of three colors that are adjacent on the color wheel. You could also choose contrasting colors. So that might be like this red and then the cool blue. But the idea is that you try to use colors that are either grouped or on the opposite end, depending on whether you want a more simple, coherent design, or if you want a contrast, like look at me sort of design. Another thing, and we'll talk about this in a later slide, you can also mirror nature a little bit, because our eyes have adjusted to really enjoy nature colors, like green and blue, or you think of like flowers on leaves, that sort of thing can tend to be pleasing to the eye. Okay, so 10 commandments of color theory. I'm not going to go through these individually, but you can refer back to the lecture to see different approaches that you can use in order to use proper colors together. So you can see, here it's sort of talking about how the different colors might give a different aura to your web page, right? Whether we're talking red is energy, intensity, versus blue is more stability, trust, serenity. You'd actually, I think, be surprised at how, if you look at what these mean, and then you look at different web pages, you'll see that there's actually a lot of matching with this. So, blue, stability, trust, serenity, you'll find that a lot of healthcare web pages are blue because of that. It doesn't work every time, but it's sort of they tend to follow some of these rules of thumbs. Okay, here's an example where colors all look similar. Here's complementary, so on and so forth as we move down. Okay. Buttons. It's nice if you create a button to create one that has depth with light and shadows. Basically, buttons are generally something that you want the user to click. So try to make them stand out rather than, being just a sort of a boring, just a color in a circle. Try to really make them jump out at the page, especially if it's a call to action that you want the user to follow. It's also nice to direct the user's attention with colors. So the reason that designexcellent.com is saying that this is a wrong scheme is because, these buttons that you're trying to not have them click stand out just as much as the ones that you want them to click. If there's really a preferred preference for how you want them to, which button you want them to click, try to make the button that you don't want them to click not stand out as much. So that's a nice technique to use And you'll notice that a lot of the times with on your computer, if there's like an OK or cancel that pops up, the OK is like bold and blue or something like that. It stands out. And then the cancel is just sort of an outline. Okay, so typography, try not to get too fancy with the font. Always use clear and readable fonts. You know, whimsy can look good in a logo, but it really doesn't look good on a web page. It confuses the user. And if you just sort of surf some of your favorite sites, you'll notice that they, for the most part, use boring fonts. And the only sites that use crazy fonts are sort of like people's personal blogs, things like that. So it just makes things less readable, and it distracts from the purpose of your site, which is some sort of call to action. Here are some guidelines for font size. So try to make sure that your body is at minimum 12 pixels. And then your header should be about twice as big as your body. H2 headers, sort of like your subheaders, could be about 150 times. And then just follow these rules in general. You don't have to follow them strictly, but these can be helpful for creating a web page that looks similar to what a user is used to, right? You of course want to differentiate, but you want to differentiate on the things that make your site unique, right? So the features, the logo, the color scheme. It's best not to differentiate on font or font size. Okay, Navbar is very important for a site, and this is something that we will go through in the second half of the lecture. But you can choose between a navbar that goes on top. These are more space efficient because they're really only taking up as much as the width or sorry, the height of the navbar. That's all they take up on the page. Whereas a side navbar tends to take up a little bit more space because it's going to need to be as wide as whatever the content of the text that you're trying to fit into the navbar is. So you'll notice that a lot of web pages that use side navbars, they'll actually hide them unless the user clicks the menu button or something like that, and that'll bring the navbar out. The advantage of the side navbar is that it's easier for the eye to scan. It can also fit more topics, and then the topics are more equal, right? With the top navbar, that first item is going to be much, much more likely to be clicked than the item 3 all the way on the right. Whereas with the side, it's really less important. The user will sort of notice everything that's on the side navbar. Of course, the top one is generally going to be the most clicked, but it's less, the eye is more likely to be able to scan that whole side navbar. You could also collapse one topic into subtopics, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the second half of the lecture. One thing I would highly recommend is copy benchmarks. So CodePen.io and CodeSandbox.io are great examples where users are able to post whatever it is that they want to post. So it could be an example of a fancy looking navbar or something like that. And they'll post it on there and provide the code that they wrote in order to create that fancy navbar. So this can be a great source for ideas on your project. The question has been asked of, is it okay to copy code from other sources? And the answer is yes. I have no problem with it. I don't call it plagiarism, but it's with a caveat. And that is that if you're going to copy someone else's code, it may not be easier than writing the code yourself. So that's something that you'll probably find out the hard way if you try to copy someone else's code. But essentially, you are going to have to figure out why they wrote the code a certain way. And in doing so, you're probably going to have to just learn everything that they had to learn in order to post the code anyway. So that's why I'm not opposed to it, because I know that you're going to have to learn a lot in adapting someone else's code. But it can be a really good source for understanding how different code works. So Mary asks, are CodePen or Code Sandbox open source? And the answer is yes, in the sense that what people post there, they are okay with other people using, sort of by definition. So they're great sources because really the entire intention of them is to get people to share their work and then potentially use each other's work. And I've certainly done that before. Another thing you can do is inspect an element from your browser. So if you right click any web page, and this example is with Chrome, you can do it with Safari. I think Chrome is really the best browser to do it with. I think Firefox works as well. I have no idea with Internet Explorer. But if you right click and then click inspect, you'll get what's called a developer's console. And then this enables you to actually see the code that went behind your favorite web page. It might be masked by ugly code. If someone used something like Wix to create their web page, you can't actually see the HTML that went into it. Wix hides it, I think, so that you can't like steal the Wix stuff. But I would say maybe half the websites that you look at, you'll be able to look at their code. And that's pretty cool. And in fact, I'll just show you. In the case of, let's go to CodePen, just so I can show you what it looks like. Okay, so with CodePen, I could search. Let's say I'm looking for nav bars. I can look for a nav bar that I think looks cool, right? I kind of like this one because it's got little tabs, and I kind of like that this thing moves, right? That's pretty cool. So if I want to adapt that, I could copy this code. And if I copy it into my code base, it might work. I don't know if it will. It might be that I'm missing some plugins, right? It probably needs jQuery. So I would need jQuery to be installed into my web page. But once that works, it could be as simple as copying it in, and then it looks like it looks here. But it also might not work that way. And you can see that there's a lot that went behind it. And if you don't understand everything that went behind it, you might find yourself in trouble when you actually try to make use of this and adapt it to your specific needs, right? You might find that it's going to take you an hour just to change this purple to red, or to change this to an about us with a different symbol or something like that. So that's where the challenge usually lies with copying code. So I'm going to right click and view page source. There we go. I can see the page source. This is meaningless code though. So there's a lot of junk in here. Oftentimes, if I'm viewing the page source, what I'll actually do is I'll try to find what I'm looking for. So let's say I'm looking for the settings button. Then I could do Control F, settings. And then you can see there's 80 results. So again, there's a lot of junk in here, but it still can be nice, right? Another thing I can do is inspect. And then I can actually, hold on, let me do, okay. Let's do inspect here. Okay, so I actually right clicked on free when I did inspect. So it's taking me to the actual free right here, okay? And then I can see as I highlight over the header, okay, the header actually covers this whole space. I can change the code here too. So this is one thing that's kind of neat. So let's do style equals color red. And I click out of here, and look, they changed free to red. So of course I didn't change this on the CodePen site, right? That would be pretty bad. But I'm able to change it on my browser. So I can see the impacts of doing interesting things with the code. How about I then we'll do a lesson in color theory as well. Background color equals blue. Okay, so this is an example where, you know, contrasting colors, blue and red, are on the opposite end of the wheel, can really bring your attention, but almost be too harsh, right? With this, if you were just to write free, okay, that kind of works, right? But if you wanted someone to read a whole paragraph, so how about we turn this into a bunch of words? This now starts to hurt, right? Try to read this all the way to the end, and then your eyes like need a break afterwards. So high contrast works with like headers or very simple statements that you really want to jump out. But if you want them to read a lot, it's going to drive them nuts. So please don't do that. So I've now ruined CodePen's site on my browser, right? Let's just try one more thing. I want to see if this is going to work. So if you all might remember techniques around display. So let's do display equals fixed. Let's see what happens. Okay, that didn't really work, but how about display equals none? There, now it disappeared. Any questions about that? So you can mess around with any site you want. Now, if you all went to this link on your browser, you'd see that it looks normal. But on my browser, it's screwed up until I reload the page, and now it's back. Okay, so that can be a neat way. You can also do that on your own page. If you kind of want to play around with certain code, but you don't want to push it to GitHub yet, you just want to see what it'll look like live, then you could use inspect to do that. Or of course you could just test it on your local computer. Either works. Any questions about how to do that or why you might do that? Okay, a little bit about FDA usability guidance. So this is also some principles that you'll want to use when designing your site. The FDA has actually traditionally regulated software interfaces on the devices. So they want to make sure that the user interfaces on your devices are actually usable and will not lead to errors that might potentially hurt patients. Of course, the importance of this whole side of the regulation has grown significantly over the last few years as we've become more digital and more cutting edge with the tools that we use in medicine in a digital sense. So in terms of the device user interface, essentially the device is going to have an output. And somehow that output needs to be perceived by the user. And then the user needs to process that output and turn that into some sort of action, right? So maybe they see that the heart rate is going up and therefore they're going to take some sort of action to stabilize the heart rate. That action needs to then go into the interface in the form of inputs that will then help the device process whatever it needs to process to fix the action, right? So heart rate goes up, that information is perceived by the user. The user will then put some inputs to say, hey, stabilize the patient, and then the device will do whatever it normally does to stabilize that patient, okay? So that's the essential interplay between device inputs and outputs and what the user does to control those inputs and outputs. There's a decision tree around errors. So we have an action that leads to an error. The first question is that action or that error at least unintended or intended? If it's unintended, then that could be broken down into slip, lapse, or mistake. If it's intended, then maybe it's the actual correct use, or maybe it's sort of an abnormal use that was still intended by the user. It might not always be malicious, it might be just a time saver. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So user errors that are unintended. A slip would be an intentional or a failure of attention. So in this case, maybe I'm supposed to do a certain keystroke at a certain time, and I just wasn't paying attention. And so I didn't do that. That's called a slip. A lapse would be a memory failure. So I just completely neglected to do something. Maybe there's a checklist of 10 things that I needed to do. I only did 8 of them. Then not doing those 2 that I was supposed to do would count as a lapse. And then a mistake is just sort of not being trained or not really knowing what to do and not doing it because of that, right? So this could be another unintentional errors. I'm paying attention. I just didn't know that I was supposed to pay attention to this one thing. Or I didn't know that I had the option of using a certain feature that I did have the option of using. So some common UI errors. The reason I have this slide up is to show really how to not do a UI. So complexity can lead to confusion or just a delay in use because somebody looks at a user interface like this and they think, oh geez, like I don't even know where to start, right? And so in doing that, that might lead to a slip or even a mistake or a lapse. So really all 3 of these user errors simply because there's too much going on. How do I learn how to do all this to prevent mistakes? How do I know where to look to prevent slips? And then how do I know when to look at a certain place to prevent lapses? So this is an example of how not to do it. Another common UI error is if error correction is too difficult. So in this case, data entry error detected after submission. Please contact an administrator to repair the entry before proceeding. So sometimes if the required action is that I actually have to pick up the phone and call someone, then that's going to lead to maybe we call that a slip because people are just not going to do what they need to do to make the application operate properly. This also could turn into an intentional user error, right? Where I just start ignoring these alerts because, well, what am I going to do? I'm not going to call the administrator. Maybe they never pick up anyway. So the solution here would be to create a way for them to fix their submission after the fact, right? So there'd be a feature that doesn't require some sort of administrative intervention to fix, or maybe I just try to prevent the error in the first place by providing helpful alerts or just making it obvious what they need to do. Obvious errors are not corrected. So that is a common user interface error. So if the email is saying you need to provide a valid email, but then it accepts John Doe, where obviously there's no @ sign, there's a space, there's no .com, .org, nothing. Yes, the user should know that this is not an email, but we shouldn't even let the user submit a form if they're not using their email. That's just asking for trouble because there's kind of a Murphy's Law with digital implementations, which is that if the user could do something wrong, they will do it wrong. Maybe not every user, but over the course of all your users, you're going to see every error in the book. So trying to provide mistake proofs wherever possible is very helpful. Also, it might be that the user interface does not draw attention to dangerous conditions. So in this case, it says, your order is potentially redundant. Last serological test for hepatitis B virus was 7/17/2006. close this window to cancel or to proceed with your order. So in this case, it's sort of, there's a better way to say this. That's not just plain text with a bunch of information that might not be relevant. Really keep your alerts to what's the point, right? Keep it simple, and don't make the user have to play detective to try to figure out what the problem is that they created. Also might be a scenario where a non-critical situation is identified as critical. So here we have a patient, John Doe, that we are trying to make a prescription order for, and it says your order is potentially dangerous if given to pregnant women. So some of these are real examples, right? This was a real example in electronic medical records where every time they prescribed a certain medication, it would give this alert that says your order is potentially dangerous if given to pregnant women. But it was also showing up if they were prescribing it to a man. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that we can, if we do something like this, we can create what's called alert fatigue. And the user is so used to receiving alerts that they start to ignore them. This is a big problem. And so make sure that what you're developing doesn't do that. You're smart with the alerts that you send out to the user, because the average user only has a certain threshold for alerts that they process before they just start clicking, okay. Wish it wasn't that way, but that's just human nature. And so we have to build our applications around that. There's also the concept of a device hazard analysis. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to identify things that could go wrong with our particular digital application, and then rank which ones are the most important. And typically when we do a hazard analysis, yes, Tyler said FMEAs. Tyler, you want to talk a little bit about what a FMEA is?
Yeah,
on the right track with that.
Yeah, it's like a table of everything wrong that could go with your, let's say, for example, a medical device, and then you would rank that that event happening by two metrics. Yeah, so severity and the probability of it, and then that would give you kind of like an overall score of how yes, dangerous or what can go wrong with your device.
Exactly. So failure modes and effects analysis. And why do we use the two dimensions of probability and severity? What's the significance of crossing those against each other? Anyone could take this question. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Is it to kind of span the gamut between likely errors that maybe aren't as dangerous but still happen and they can be like an annoyance, versus really dangerous errors that are rare, but if they do happen, they're really bad. So I guess you, as a manufacturer, want to know everything that could possibly happen.
Yeah, exactly. So just because something is high probability or high severity doesn't mean that it's this terrible thing that we need to mitigate. What we really want to mitigate are the things that are both severe and likely. And then those that are sort of in the middle, we just need to do more research and figure out, is this an acceptable risk, or do we need to start to put mitigations in place to try to prevent it from happening? And then on this side, where we have not severe, not remote, we just don't have to worry about them. We know that they are acceptable without the need to implement any sort of risk controls. And this, by the way, is something that really would be required for any of your applications to actually be used by anyone. You would need to do a hazard analysis both in terms of what could go wrong with the user interface and how that works with the patients or the providers, but also in terms of security. So what are potential vulnerabilities that you might have to hacking or to people misusing the data that maybe they have access to through your website? So this is something that any of your customer security teams are going to require that you do. We're not going to require it in this class, but just know that this is a very important element. And it applies to so many things, not just softwares. It's not just medical devices. You'll see this pop up, I think, almost certainly throughout your careers. Okay, a little bit of a code primer. I've gotten the question of what's the difference between front end and back end. The main difference is that front end is what the user sees. So this is what shows up on the browser as a web page. And it consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, JavaScript kind of straddles front end and back end. So it's definitely a front end language. I mean, it's actually run from the user's browser. But it can do stuff behind the scenes. You can create data structures, tables, arrays that don't show up on the page. And in our case, we're going to use that as a backend substitute simply because to teach backend, we don't have enough time to teach backend in this class. So we're going to use JavaScript to do that. Now, the true backend is what's called server side. And server side is completely hidden from the user. There's no way that they can see it. You remember when I did the inspect element of a web page, I can only see their front end language. So I can look at their HTML, their CSS, their JavaScript. I have no visibility whatsoever to their back end language. And so that's sometimes where their secret sauce will hide. Maybe like with Facebook, Instagram, that's where all the data is of all of their users, all the users' images, their friends, etc. And they can use that to figure out who to market to and things like that. And what they process on the back end can then show up on the front end. So on my back end language, I might dig up a bunch of information, use machine learning and determine, hey, this person is in the market for cupcakes. And then I can then pass cupcake ads into my front end. And then the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that I can see by right-clicking their page will now just use inputs that are ads of cupcakes. And then that's what enriches the people of Facebook and Instagram. So it's really that simple. It's sort of HTML, CSS, JavaScript all run through the browser. Backend will pull from databases that the user can't see, and then they just push the relevant information into the front end. Any questions about that? I like to liken HTML to the skeleton and CSS to sort of like the skin, the clothes, the hair color, all that. So with HTML, we might have the head, the body, and the footer. And then the basic outline of our site. So what goes on top, what goes on the bottom, what does it say? And then the CSS will actually fill in the details. So what color is this going to be? What shape will it be? What does it look like? What's the position going to be? So we call the HTML the structural layer, and that's where the content goes. Whereas we call the CSS the presentational layer, and that's what styles the web page. So what does JavaScript do? Well, it might be a button that when I click it, it makes these spin around. So with JavaScript, I could code something where if the button is clicked, make my bodies on the left and the right spin, right? Or if the button is clicked, make something suddenly appear on the page. So JavaScript is kind of like the magic that makes a page dynamic. It's a very, very important language. It's kind of the link to everything else. So I've gotten some questions about, are we going to learn how to code apps? Well, we're not really going to learn how to code apps, but a lot of the apps are built on something that looks like JavaScript. And so you have to learn JavaScript first. It's kind of like the prerequisite, because once you understand JavaScript, you can understand very quickly what all of these other languages that are used to build native apps built on. So it's kind of like learning, Latin in order to learn Spanish, that sort of thing. But even better, because Latin doesn't always give you the full scope, whereas JavaScript, once you understand it, you'll know how to do the other languages. It's pretty easy to pick them up. Okay, what is the head? The head doesn't really show up on the page, but it does some useful things. So it can let the browser know how to read the characters on your page. So you'll see on a lot of web pages, this meta character set UTF-8. It also can put the title in the browser tab. So if we look at on our open browser, the tabs that we have, they all say something, right? They might say search results or inbox, something like that. That is determined by what you write in the title brackets. They also help link to your other files. So if you want to use your CSS file, you're going to have to create a link to that CSS file. And then you can also put other meta info. So if you want to use Google Analytics or Facebook Open Graph, which makes it so that if you share a link, it's not just a link, but it shows up as like an image with a little preview. Or if you want to use language localization, that all happens in the head. So if I want someone who has a Spanish browser to be able to read the site in Spanish, then I could use these language localization techniques in the head to do so. The body is everything that actually shows up on the screen. So here we have any headers, any paragraphs, buttons, lists, images. This is where the majority of your coding is going to be. This is what makes your web page look like you want it to look. Okay, final note on coding, and that's troubleshooting. So if you ever have any problems with your code, my number one advice is to Google the issue that you have exactly as it appears in your brain. So if your problem is like, what do I do to make this button work right? Then you could just Google that thing. Maybe add a few more details, like this HTML button does not go to the href page when I click it, right? Then Google that, and then someone else will have had that exact same problem, and someone else will have solved their problem, likely on Stack Overflow or GitHub. I personally prefer Stack Overflow. I think it's a very nice format. And it's sort of like a web forum where people ask questions and they get them answered, and usually answered several times. So you can kind of pick the answer that you like the most. It's very trustworthy because it's a very active space with a lot of developers who spend a lot of their time just cleaning things up. So you're very unlikely to, have someone who's trying to like sabotage your code or anything on Stack Overflow. So, I use it all the time, almost every day. And I found it to be incredibly useful. And then if these things don't work, you can always email me. But once you get the basic skills of coding, to get better, it's really just a matter of Googling the right questions and getting the answers. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we will jump into some group work. And here's where we can talk a little bit about things that weren't working on GitHub. Once we do the group work, we'll jump back in. I'll go over any common issues that I was seeing, if there's something that's relevant to all the teams, and then I'll jump into some live coding exercises for y'all. Okay. So let's come back at 4:01.
So in index.html,
Mhm.
that's our homepage.
Yes, yeah, GitHub pages recognizes index as the homepage no matter what.
So
And
we
then-
could just copy all of this out.
Yeah, you could put all of that in your index if that's intended to be your homepage.
Yeah, we were just kind of playing around with it, but yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna go join another page or another team, and I'll come back to you guys and help you out.
Oh, hello.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
Okay. So I mentioned at the beginning of class, I was having the same problem as Mary,
Mhm.
where we've been trying to like see our output essentially. And so I changed it to my username because I'm the like project coordinator or whatever.
Mhm.
But so the idea is that I would select this and put it into a new browser, correct?
Yeah, it looks like you're missing an M though. So your username is M Malak, and then
Oh no, you're totally right. I didn't even realize that.
and I can't vouch, although I would like to see this just to see how it would work. I can't vouch for how like just changing the name would work versus sort of like creating a thing and starting it from scratch. But I hope this works. That would be nice.
Let's try.
It
Yeah,
also
because
might
I'm getting-
take a few minutes. My experience, GitHub pages, it takes usually a minute or two to fully update.
Okay. Yeah, because I was trying it like a few times, even just with like the Botox bubble and everything, and it was giving me that 404 message.
Yeah. And let me see your index. It looks like you've got a pretty solid setup on your index, right?
Well, we started
Mm-hmm.
coding a
Okay,
bit, but
cool.
we're still in the
Yeah, and that all
Beginning
checks
stages.
out. Looks pretty good to me. So that should show up.
okay.
Let's try reloading again.
Uh-uh.
Okay.
Is there anything like I was trying to read in this start guide to see anything, but it's still striking out.
The only thing I can think is because it didn't start as that maybe you'd have to create a new one. Let me jump in. I know that there's another team who visited me during office hours.
Yeah, I think it was Mary.
Yeah, let me see if they figured it out by changing, but it looks now that your naming is correct. The only thing I can think of is maybe because you changed it rather than creating a new one, that might not work.
Okay, well, if you could ask them and then pop back in,
Yeah.
that would be great.
I'll do that.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, team.
Hello.
Professor.
Is the GitHub pages working for you all now?
So we changed the repository name to the username.github.io.
Yes.
But I think so Pablo's having an issue with pushing now. And I think Chris is checking to see if he can still push after the name change.
Yeah, you might have to reset your origin, your remote origin, to reflect the new name of the repository. And you might just have to delete everything and then sort of start from the beginning, do the cloning and all of that.
Yeah, I was able to just push it with once I like recloned with the new name.
Okay, great.
So we weren't sure if we so I made another like new token just to see if it's a token thing. So now we have like the old token and the new token. We're just
okay, and it
seeing
looks
what
like
needs
your
to be
page
fixed.
works.
Yeah.
So that's good. I just went on it and I see. Yeah, there's some people. So you guys weren't the only people who did not name it correctly. So that's sort of a lesson for me. I'll try to really heavily emphasize the naming of the repository. But some others are having trouble now because even though they've renamed it, it still is not showing up as a page. Was there anything else that you all did? And probably more talking to you, Akin, to get it to work? Or did it pretty much show up on the website immediately?
No, I mean, as soon as I changed the name to that, it was good to go. I think maybe whoever made the repository, just to double check, like when they're on the repository, it says their username / and then repeats their username with .github.io.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let me know, or are there any questions that I can help with about the connecting to the repository? My guess, Chris and Pablo, is just delete everything and then reclone the new repository name and like set your remote origin and all of that as explained in the lecture slides. And then at that point, you should be good.
Okay. Let me just figure out how to delete everything.
Chris, any issues on your end?
No, I just got the repository cloned and the extension working in Visual Studio. I'm gonna push something right now.
Great. I mean, of course, since you all are pushing, make sure that once that's happened, that everyone else pulls so that you're up to date. Okay, I'm gonna check out another room. How are you all doing?
Hello.
Doing well. Getting done our script and I think finalizing how we're going to set up our first web pages.
Great. And any issues with the GitHub? Is that working properly?
Yeah, I think we're all good.
Yeah.
Awesome. That is the hardest part. So some teams, they take a little bit of time to figure that out. So if you all got that, then you're in good shape.
Okay.
I mean, is there anything more to do once you link GitHub, VS Code, and like learning how to merge and upload your edits?
That's the main part. You know, I think, you know, who's the Scrum Master on this project?
I am.
Yeah, so Sophia, I think one thing that'll be important for you is just to make sure that the work is distributed such that people aren't working on the same file at the same time. Now I'll get into that during lecture, but you really don't want overlap. That's where you'll start to run into weird things.
Okay, so like if we were to work on our code, we should like just assign different times. We're like, oh, I'm working on the code, I'll update it, and then whoever the next person can then like go into that.
Yep. And then, so if someone works on a certain file at a certain time, and then someone else is going to go in later, what does that person who goes in later have to do before they start their work? This is the big thing.
Check the name or like the branches or something.
Close. So on Git, they got to do something. Tyler, I think you started to say something.
Did they have to clone it?
Not clone, but close. So cloning would copy the whole repository over again. You don't need to do that because you've already done that. What you need to do is git pull, right?
Yes.
So,
okay.
Right.
It's basically just, it's keeping the same files, but it's making the minor changes to the files that will get you up to date with whatever the person who went in push code before you did. If you don't do that, and at some point, like, it's not a big deal. One of you is going to write a bunch of code. You're going to spend a couple hours doing it. And then you're going to try to push and it's going to say, uh-oh, your code is not up to date. There's conflicts. So what you'll want to do then is just sort of copy the code that you did, pull it, accept the pull changes so that it'll sort of revert your code back to where it was. And then you can just paste the changes that you made back in. So it's not a huge deal, but it's kind of how you prevent conflicts.
Is it like almost like a refresh or something?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. It's like a refresh. But then, you know, if you've made changes before the refresh, then somehow you're gonna have to figure out a way to sort of remove those changes or at least copy them, refresh, and then put them back in. So that's sort of the consequence of forgetting to pull. It's not a huge deal, but it'll be annoying.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
I think we're okay for now.
All right, great.
Here. So use C pattern.
How are y'all doing?
We're good. We're kind of brainstorming on like what we actually wanna, like what we wanna say, and we're like using our mockup to like kind of translate that into what we're actually gonna do.
Great. And any questions about the GitHub part of it, or is it working for you all?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Are you using Alex or
Oh, sorry. We changed it to the one that's under my username.
Okay,
They found a
gotcha.
really long one.
Cool. So, and I just went into yours, Alec, and it looks like the pages part is working. So if you do the alec.github.io, it says hello world. So that's nice. Is everyone hooked up to it? Have you tried pushing code?
Yeah, like we wanted to brainstorm first, and then like if we have more time, like we want to do it together, like a mini
Great. Yeah.
like trial of GitHub, like all of us working together.
Awesome. Cool. Let me know if you run into any issues. You know, sometimes people do, and it's usually a pretty simple fix, but you kind of got to know what fix is required for the given situation. And so at this point, I've seen it all. So I'm available if you all have any questions.
Yeah, thank you. GitHub can get a little bit messy, but yeah.
All right, great.
All right.
Thank you.
The city is where.
Hey, how are y'all doing?
Are you in?
I will.
Hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
We're just doing the wireframing, an actual mock-up. So we do want to ask you, so the functional, because I think Jeanette is basing this idea on an actual test. That's a standardized test for determining Alzheimer's, whether you have for diagnosis, right? And in the test, Jeanette, in the actual test, there's like 6 different categories of tests. Essentially, the patient does have to go through all 6. However, some of them are, we determine out of those 6 for our prototype, some of them are just really difficult to code for the length of time. So we just pick like one, actually, we just pick the easiest 3 out of the 6 for a prototype. For example, Jeanette, can you pull up the actual, for example, so this is the actual test.
Oh,
Visual
cool.
spatial, yeah, good luck coding that. Like, yeah, good luck coding. Draw a clock. Yeah, have fun having a program that actually can read that. Right. So we decided to use just the naming, which is basically we'll just display pictures and type the name of this animal or whatnot. And then we also wanted to do but for a very, very first prototype is at the very bottom, there is orientation. It's literally what date is it today?
Yeah.
What month is it today? And so we're making the wireframe for that and that also will help us. Our idea is that will help us with the CSS, the colors, and also the actual back end, the inputs and outputs.
This is great. I didn't realize this during the wireframe presentation, but the way this test is set up is really perfect for your prototype. right? And so it takes a little bit of the brainstorming part that's difficult out of the equation. You can just say, okay, well, how do I make this digital? So I like it. And it's also probably a good application, right? For something that actually could be useful because this paper is very outdated, right? So I like it. I would say, yeah, assess, especially as you start to learn more JavaScript, which of these you think will be a good challenge, whereas might be too much of a challenge. And I think two things to focus on is one, go deep into at least one. But you don't necessarily have to go deep into multiple ones. I would say the other component is show what that interface looks like before you choose your game, So you can focus a little bit on that so that it looks like you've got all the games, but when you're doing the demo, you're just showing them one or two of them. So, they don't have to know that you haven't created the visual spatial one. I think as long as you're able to, in the span of, 15 minutes, show what looks to be a coherent app, then you'll be in good shape. And that also applies to user testing, right? You're showing just enough to get them excited. And they don't have to know that the visual spatial is a work in progress.
And we can actually kind of see it if you pull up the balsamic wireframe. It's essentially, this is what I mean. The colors are not there literally, but it's just welcome, name, date of birth, and then literally this is one of the modules. It's a time space module, and then it's like what today's date, and then you click done and it picks you up. So we design it with very simple big blocks, and we don't want to overwhelm. So we added like a done, so they don't have to type in an actual date.
Yep. And that's obviously huge with the elderly population.
Correct. And it actually, because they score each of these things separately.
Yep.
So yeah, it's essentially, we'll just try to code this for now. Something very, very simple. Literally, it's just what date is it? What month? What year is it right now? Where are you right now? Are you at home? And what city are you in right now? And I just thank you for your participation. That's it.
Great. Yeah, I think you got a good start. How about with the GitHub? Are you all connected? Do you know how to push code? Okay, great. Yeah, it looks like you all are doing well. So I think in terms of how far you are and understanding the GitHub part, you're probably the most progressed along the way. So I definitely encourage you to share with your peers any lessons learned on that. And if you do, that'll count as participation. So
we just Googled everything.
Yeah,
basically Stack Overflow everything.
That's coding in a nutshell. And I'm glad that you got into Stack Overflow early, because it's tremendously helpful. I mean, I essentially learned how to code on Stack Overflow, right? I sort of took a little tiny bit of formal training, but not much at all. I didn't major in it or anything. But then once I kind of got enough to be dangerous, and dangerous in a bad way, like completely break things, Stack Overflow helped me learn how to build instead of break. And most coders that are self-taught. I mean, now more than ever, people are taking formal training, right? The CS programs are as competitive as they've ever been, but a lot of coders are self-taught. It's eminently self-teachable. So, and Stack Overflow is a great way to do it. Cool. Any questions for me?
Not for me. That's
all right.
Thanks.
Great.
Thanks for the compliment.
Groups.
Okay.
Okay.
CSS is a different file. It's like think of it as a giant function that you call into the HTML, and they're in the same folder. So they communicate with each other. Based off the homework, it's not the same file.
Hey, I see it works now.
Yeah.
It looks cool.
Thanks for the information on embedding YouTube videos.
Yeah. So was this just a matter of waiting?
Yeah, it was just like a minute.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that GitHub has well, this is everything. GitHub is actually faster than really anything else that I've used. But it's sort of, you think it didn't work and then you wait a minute and then suddenly it works. So any questions? Are you all hooked up now to the GitHub, or anyone struggling with that component, being able to push from your local to GitHub?
So I can edit on our index HTML on GitHub. Yeah, I was just trying to figure out for the CSS part. Mary was just explaining it, because I think I'll be helping out with the CSS other than the project management.
Right.
Just how to navigate into that.
And let me look at your code. I have so many tabs open right now. Actually, how about you all show me? Show me your GitHub page. Okay.
Thanks.
So what you're going to need to do, and I'd recommend actually doing this on your local computer, and this only applies to one of you. So on your local computer, create a folder called SRC, and then insert a CSS document into that folder.
Yeah.
And the way to insert a CSS document is you basically just do new on your VS Code and then save it as,
Yeah. I've done that.
period.css. And then once you've done that, you can reference the CSS file in the index. And then once that's happened, then whatever you put in the CSS will work.
It's the same with images. Calling
Yep.
an image.
Exactly.
That's a song. That's what we were talking about just now. So like if you're trying to embed it, if you have a video that you're trying to add, anything that you're trying to add into your main code that's not part of that main structure, you call it like a function. Like f of x equals x plus squared plus 2. You assign a number to x, but that in your calculator is somewhere else, and it pulls that function in because you're calling it in. So that's more or less how it works.
Yeah, and I'll go through it once we return back to the main lecture. That's sort of my next thing to show you all. Okay. Cool. So
you wanted to look at our codes?
Yeah, so it was mainly just to see whether you had the folder yet. So you'll have to create that folder.
Yeah.
And I call it SRC because that's like a common way to do it, but it can be called anything you want. And you don't even have to create a folder. I just find it's messy if you have your JavaScript CSS file along with your HTMLs, but I won't judge if you want to put them all in the home directory.
What we were focusing on was just creating like that backbone this past week. So we have two that we're going to combine because I didn't think to email you before I started app version.
Sure.
So we have two that we're going to try and combine.
Great.
And we quickly learned on the website that we needed to start building the CSS because our navigation bar, like it gets really wonky to do it all in HTML. Like you could, but like putting it centered, putting it top and bottom.
For sure. And I'll show you how to use Bootstrap to do that as well. The only thing that I observed that may cause you trouble, it may not, I don't know. But your HTML files have spaces in them. So notice in your URL up top, it says PCOS. If you go back to that the HTML file that you were in. So you see how the HTML file, it says up top in your URL slot, it says PCOS percentage 20 diet percentage 20 tracker.html. That's because browsers get confused by spaces. So that might cause problems when you try to link to it. I don't know actually, because I've never, to be honest, created an HTML file with spaces. But if it does cause you problems, the solution would be to rename that file to all one word. So you could either just remove the
Oh,
spaces.
this spaces?
Yeah. So you could either remove the spaces or you could replace the spaces with hyphens, something like that. That's sort of the typical naming convention for HTML files. Again, you might be fine. I don't know, because I've never tried it.
It was
But
running fine when I was doing it out of VS. I didn't have any problems
okay, yeah.
exporting it and running the code.
But here's where you might run into problems. So you need to, if you want to link to the different files, right, as if they were another page, you're going to have to do an href that links to that specific HTML file. And I'm thinking that the href logic is going to get confused by the spaces.
Oh, right, because dashes are spaces in a name.
Yeah.
I understand that.
So you might need to do that. I don't know, because I haven't tried, but just a sort of a heads up in case that ends up being a problem down the road. You'll know how to fix it. Okay.
Cool.
All right.
What is no Jekyll for?
That's to bypass. GitHub Pages has a weird, I shouldn't say weird, but it's sort of made for blogging, and they have some sort of helper widget called Jekyll that helps convert what you're doing into a blog. I don't know what it does, but if you want more of a free form, whatever you code goes on the screen, then you just put no Jekyll, and then it ignores the Jekyll helper widget. So
If we have another question.
Mhm.
So one thing that we're interested in doing, it's in this app one. You can't really see it right now. I can actually just run the code for my computer. So here, it's a little more evolved because I thought we were doing an app. So we have PCOS friendly foods, and then we have this external link here. Recipe. What we feel would be more like interesting and beneficial is if this is an input, like they input them, and then we have like a bunch of different recipes, and it just spits out recipes for those recipes for the inputs. We're just not sure how ambitious that's gonna be.
I think you can do it. It's ambitious, but it's not too ambitious. I would encourage you to look up and write this down. JavaScript listener events. So you can have a JavaScript event that listens for keystrokes, particularly keystrokes into a field. And then what you can do is on each keystroke, it will execute a function that will look for whatever you've typed so far, and then use that to filter the attributes of something, right? So you could say, hide everything that doesn't say Bach in it, and then only show my things that say Bach, and then it'll be a nice little like search filter.
Okay, so like in terms of the MVP, because it's kind of like it's a social media page for women with PCOS. So there's like the support and like a blogging area. But in terms of the MVP, this would be like the most elaborated part. Would that fit the model?
I think so. But you know, I would encourage you to look at exactly what your user story is, and then see like what is going to be my most bang for my buck feature that would address that story. And this sounds like something that would fit the bill, but I'd encourage you to answer that question as a team. You know, in terms of determining your priorities. And you know, you might find that there is a higher priority, but then you might find that that one's maybe easier to implement. So you can implement that and then decide, hey, we got some time, let's tackle something else. And that'll be impressive, right? So
yay.
All right. All right, how's it looking?
Well, the
getting.
page shows up. The
The
page
page shows up,
now.
good.
Yeah.
It magically starts showing up after a few minutes, right?
Yeah, it took like 10 minutes, but it came up.
Hey, by the way, I kind of like that. It looks like you already have a logo for your tab.
Do we?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Is that your page at the end with the scissors?
No.
Oh, is that one?
No.
Okay.
I would love it if we did. Well, so right now we're having a bit of a problem. Well,
Uh-huh.
I don't know, we're just like a bit all over the place. But we're trying to find out how to make like essentially, oh, where are they? I got lost now. We're trying to find out like how to make these, for example,
Sure.
like buttons that link to different pages.
Yeah, yeah. So all you would do is put that within an A element. Does anyone remember what that is from the HTML with the A and then the href?
Yeah, vaguely. But why can I not edit this here?
And you know what? I'll actually, that's kind of my next thing in the live coding. So I'll make sure that I cover that.
Okay, should we hold off on that for this week then?
I think maybe after what I show you, you'll be in good shape to make that happen.
Okay.
And are you going to try to link to outside links or your own different HTML pages?
Our own.
Okay, great. I'll show you exactly how to do that.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Cool. So I think I'm going to end the breakout soon. So go ahead and start to wrap things up.
Okay, sounds good.
We'll join the main team.
Thanks.
And stuff.
All right. How are y'all doing?
Yeah, I think that would be a good approach to doing that.
Yeah.
We were able to get it to work.
Excellent.
Yeah, a little trial and error, but we got it to work.
Yeah, that's coding. It's a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
And then you figure it out, and then you run into a new problem. So it's one problem after the another, but by the end, you realize that you've created something really cool. Any questions?
For next week's deliverables, you want us to kind of have like a very like prototype of the website, as well as like a user like testing like kind of script, right? Like that's what.
Yeah, I'd like you guys to be ready to do the user testing. If you've done a little bit, great, but really I want to see the bulk of the majority or the bulk of the user testing being done in week 7, so that you have sort of another week to react to the feedback that you get. But when you do the testing, you're going to want to have something robust to show them. So you'll kind of have like a week and a half to build something on your own, then do the user testing, and then another week and a half to reflect the feedback that you've gotten.
Okay, and we're in week 5, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move to the next team, but then definitely ping me if you have any other questions.
I know they break a lot of the for people who play volleyball. They're TSCL or something, right?
I will.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
Hello.
Doing good.
Good.
Okay, is everything working?
Yeah.
Usual?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, we're making like user stories more specific. Yeah.
All right, well, I'm going to start wrapping things up. So you'll probably have about a minute, and then we'll rejoin the big group. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, can you all see my slides? Great. All right, I think you all are doing a good job. So I think there are definitely some struggles at first, but then we all got to the place where we need to be, which is we've got a GitHub pages that shows up. I think for the most part, everyone's linked. If they're not, just sort of one step away. So that's the hard part, is getting everyone aligned in the collaborative coding part. And now that I think we're there with all the teams, and please take advantage of office hours if you feel like you're not there. We can just focus on the coding. And frankly, the coding is, I think, with the knowledge that you have and our ability to work together, I want to be able to show you some live coding that reflects problems that you all are having. Should not be too difficult. Okay. So feel free to peruse the YouTube lecture of this breakout period if you wanted to sort of see where other teams are at. I think by the end of the breakouts, actually everyone's pretty much in the same place. So great work. Oh, one more thing. I think the expectation for next week is try to, on the coding side, get that first draft of your page up and running. And then on the user testing side, try to get your script ready so that you're good to go for the user testing. And then not this coming week, but the week after, that's when I want you to start looking at your user testing so that you've sort of, there's about 3 weeks remaining. You got a week and a half to build that first draft, and then a week and a half to react to the results that you get from the user testing, and build an even better application. Mary, you have a question?
Yeah, by page, do you mean just like the whole homepage or everything?
Mostly just something that is vaguely usable, but not quite, right? Like I said, about a week and a half to start user testing. So I want by our lecture for you to have something that you can work with. Maybe it's not yet ready for user testing, but in our breakouts, we can talk about what we need to be able to get there. And then I can take that information to figure out what I need to show you in the live code to break through any barriers that you have, right? If you've got nothing, I can't help you, right? So try to have something that we can all work with. I'm not grading you on the status of it, but this is more just like to help track where you need to be at a certain time to end up with a good project at the end. And then the expectation would be mid-week after next, it's ready to show to someone. If not, it's sort of going to be too late to get your user feedback and then incorporate that into your prototype. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. Any other questions? All right. So Bootstrap is a very nice framework. It does a lot of work for you. I'll show you how to link that. I'll also show you how to link jQuery. Once you've done that in your head section, you're going to be in good shape to incorporate some of those elements into your web page design. Bootstrap has a lot of different things. This link is super useful. So remember this part of the lecture, right? It's about a little over 2 hours in, where I bring up Bootstrap because there's a lot of learning that could happen through this link. So I'd encourage you to click it, see what Bootstrap offers and what you might want to apply to your particular web page. Navbar. So this is kind of the first part of live coding. I'm going to show you how to import Bootstrap and jQuery, and then how to incorporate that into your Navbar. And then there's a little bit of CSS that goes along with that. So you have this as kind of a code review that you can use if you just want to copy my code. But I'm going to show you live what that looks like. Okay. So this is my code right now. And then my page is this, right? So it's just this hello world, not much to look at yet, right? But you can see that I've done a little bit of styling, but I've done it in line. So I have my hello world and I've just styled it inline. I'm not using any CSS files yet. Okay, so the first thing I've done is I've added a few elements to my head. You can see that I've titled it ALS414 project template. So that actually shows up in my tab. If I were to call this Will's project template, it's actually not going to show up because this is the GitHub, but I can then also remember right click, copy path, and then put that into my browser. So this is my local version. Will's project template, right? Same goes with if I want to change the question mark to an exclamation point, it does that, right? But it hasn't yet been reflected in the GitHub. So I know that these changes that I'm making are not going to impact what my team members are working with yet, because I haven't pushed the code through. Okay. So a few things that you want to add. This char set UTF-8, don't worry about what it means. It's basically telling the browser how to read the characters. Just put it in. The same with this viewport. And then it says device width, initial scale. This is what helps the browser or your phone browser work with the web page. So it helps you like zoom in, zoom out, things like that. So this is a valuable line of code to put in. Now, these are really what I want to draw your attention to. So there's this link href src/base.css. So this is basically telling the code where to look for my CSS. And then this is my base.css. So in my case, I've actually created a folder called src. You could do that by right-clicking within your Explorer and then new folder. So maybe I want to create another folder called like videos, right? Then it'll create this folder. And then within that, I can create a new file and then save it to whatever I want to save it to, right? So in this case, let's call this like other CSS file. Put some hyphens to make it look better, .css. And maybe I want to put that in my videos folder, which obviously this makes no sense, but I'm just trying to show you sort of how to go through this process. So other CSS file .css, all I did is save it as a CSS, and my Visual Studio Code automatically recognizes this as a CSS file. And it's in my videos. So I don't have that yet. So I'm going to create another CSS link. Videos, other CSS file. And now it's linked, but there's obviously nothing in here yet. So I want to maybe style something. So how about I'm going to style something called header text. And I want the font size to equal 24 pixels, color to be green, and then how about font weight to be 800, right? That's a pretty thick font weight. Now I go back to my index and I'm going to take away the style. Now if I reload my page, look, all the styling went away. But now I'm going to add a class. And what did I call that? Header text. Okay. So now I reload it and it's green, thick, basically how I want it. Like I said, I don't really like things to be up on the margin like this. So what I'm going to do is instead of actually styling the font this way, I'm going to put everything inside of a div. And I'm going to give that div a class called, let's call it large margins. Okay. And I can go into my other CSS file, create another thing called large margins. And then we're going to say the margin equals about 40 pixels. And that's going to apply 40 to the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. Okay. So now everything within my div is nicely margined, right? I have enough white space. Now, maybe I actually don't want it to be evenly applied, left, right, top, bottom. Instead, I would like the top to be 40. I want the right to actually only be 20. The bottom to be 40, and then the left to be 20. Now, this is just kind of the nomenclature of how margins go. It's top, right, bottom, left. So it's kind of like clockwise motion starting with top. Now you're going to notice when I reload, it's going to move a little bit to the left, but it's going to stay with the top margin. Right? So that worked. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing CSS, this dot signifies a class, not an ID. Okay. So let's say that I wanted to actually call large margins an ID instead of a class. All of a sudden, it didn't work, right? Because my CSS file is telling it to look for a class. If I wanted to look for an ID, I use that hash symbol. Now it works again. Okay, so that's just distinguishing from a class to an ID. And you might ask, why do I want to use a class versus an ID? The main rule of thumb is if there's a lot of instances of something, use a class. Or really, if there's multiple instances, use a class. So like header text, subheaders, paragraph text, images, where you're going to have a lot of images, use a class. If it's a single incidence of something, use an ID. That's the main rule of thumb, because IDs really only will work for one instance. And in this case, I'm really only going to use this large margin once. And I'm going to put everything within it. So it'll work as an ID. But honestly, usually I would probably make it a class. Just I typically use IDs for like JavaScript calls, things like that. But just wanted to show you the difference. Any questions about that? Okay, so I showed you how to link a CSS file. You don't have to do two. I just created a second one so that I could show you that process, and I already had one linked. But as long as you have one, it's fine. And you don't have to name it SRC as I have. You could name it, you know, CSS/base.css, whatever you want. As long as what you call the folder matches how you direct to it in the href, you'll be fine. Any questions about that? That's a big one. And if you have any problems with how to link your CSS files or your JavaScript files, just let me know. You notice here that I actually linked my JavaScript file at the bottom. You could link it at the top or the bottom. Generally, you want JavaScript that needs to be loaded at the very beginning to load at the top. Stuff that sort of could wait until the rest of the page loads, it's okay to load at the bottom. And by loading it at the bottom, you're making the page load a little bit quicker. So that's why I have this link to the bottom. But if I put it at the top, it would still work. But I'm not going to show you any JavaScript right now anyway. Okay. All right, so I got my hello world. It's in a container. Oh, that looks nice. Let's build a navbar. Oh yeah, before I do that, I'll show you. You can just copy this word for word, but by linking to this web page for Bootstrap, I'm basically incorporating Bootstrap into my my web page. Okay, and the same here with this this file. So I'm basically taking the Bootstrap CSS and the Bootstrap JavaScript. Okay.
Oh, question about the
Yes.
bootstrap. Is it like in Microsoft Office when you can download more images and clip art into your library that you can pull from to build
Yeah.
like a PowerPoint?
That's a good way to put it. Although it's mainly for formatting. As far as I know, although I could be wrong about this, Bootstrap doesn't really come with actual images, but it does come with pre-built CSS. So you'll find that if you use Bootstrap, without having to actually create your own CSS, you can have actually kind of nice looking things like the Navbar. So they're sort of saying, essentially what they're doing is, we put a lot of work into showing you what a Navbar could look like so that you don't have to do it and you can focus on your application itself. So you'll find that there will be certain applications where Bootstrap does exactly what you need. And so you won't need CSS for it. But you'll find there are other cases where you're like, you know what, for me to have this site look the way that I want to look, I got to do the CSS myself.
I have another question
Mhm.
about the functions that you're calling. How come I've noticed sometimes like body, for example, or title, it'll be bold blue, and then other times it's bold red.
On my specific page?
Like I've noticed it when I was coding too. Sometimes in the code itself,
Mhm.
Visual Studios will put it in boldface blue and sometimes boldface red.
So like here?
Yeah.
So they use this coloring is basically the advantage of using Visual Studio versus like Notepad, right? You can actually edit code in Notepad, but nobody does it because these colors will help you understand what's an element name versus what's sort of a characteristic within the element name versus what's like actual type and all of that. You can basically, the colors don't mean anything inherently, but you'll start to understand why they're coloring things a certain way. And the reason why I say that they don't mean anything inherently is that you can actually change the color scheme. I don't remember how to do it off the top of my head, but this is like a color setting. Let's see if I can figure it out. It's probably within the preferences color theme. So if I want to call it, so I'm using One Dark Pro. If I want to call it like Quiet Light, there. Now it's completely different colors. So the colors like don't inherently mean anything. It's sort of what's the style that you like. And then once you find the style that you like, I hate this. I want to get out of this immediately, right? So once you find the style that you like, it's best to stick with it because you'll get used to what the colors mean. So it's like internally consistent, but there's no like tribunal that says blue must mean this, red must mean that. Okay. I did notice actually that in this case, I lost JavaScript. So let me just link to, or jQuery, link to jQuery for HTML page. So I'm going to use this. The reason I'm using this instead of the example here is this is assuming that I have jQuery downloaded to my repository, which is perfectly legit. You could do that, but I don't have that. So I'm looking for the script that is sourcing something on the internet. So that means that it won't work if I don't have internet access on my local computer, but I don't have to worry about downloading the code. So that's sort of like a shortcut. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to put that here. Okay. So now I've got jQuery too. That's how you plug different types of code into your code base. You just sort of Google it. Like, what did I Google? I Googled link to jQuery HTML. So sort of a very shorthand way of saying, I want jQuery into my HTML. Can you give me a link? And then W3 Schools is a great resource for that. And guess what? They got it for me. So I just copied that, put it in my code base. Okay. So all that to say, get your Bootstrap CSS, get your Bootstrap JavaScript, and get your jQuery JavaScript. And then you'll be in a good position to leverage a lot of the tools that those engines provide for you. Okay. So has anything changed with my site? Where'd it go?
Will, just one
Yes.
question. So Bootstrap is essentially like Python libraries.
So Python libraries are sort of a whole nother ball game, and I don't have, unfortunately, enough time to show you all that. But with Python, what you'll end up doing is in your terminal, you'll download packages.
Correct.
And so it'll be like a pip package as an example. And then that will enable you to download backend helpers that have done a lot of work on, let's say as an example, like how to reconcile times and dates across time zones. There's a package where someone has done a lot of the work for you so that you don't have to do it yourself. And it's a very similar principle to what I just mentioned with Bootstrap, where someone else did all the boring work of figuring out how to format a typical navbar, so that all you have to do is use their their call signs, and then you don't have to worry about the formatting yourself. So I'll show you right now what those call signs look like. Okay, so again, I've imported Bootstrap. So now I know we're good to go with Navbar. So Bootstrap has given me a new element name called nav that I can now call in order to make it work. So in this case, I'm going to call my class Navbar, and then I want to use Navbar fixed top. Okay. And now I'm going to put everything within this navbar. So I can do a span within this, and then the class will be navbar brand. And then within that, I want to put my logo. So maybe img class navbar logo. And then because it's an IMG, I need to source it. And let's put it, let's actually just, I'm going to find a logo real quick. Let's use the KGI logo. I'm going to look for something small, like an icon. Cool. This looks good. So I'm going to right click this logo and then copy the link address. There. So now I'm going to steal KGI's logo, right? Ooh, actually, this might not have worked because it's got to actually be an image file name. So if I open it in a new tab, okay, this is actually the link that I want, because I want it to end with a image file name, like JPG. Let's use that and close that out. Let's see what happens. Copy path. All right, now I got KGI's logo on my navbar. Looks ugly. We're not done yet, but it's a start. Okay, so now I want to do the Bootstrap navbar sort of nomenclature is using the list format. So I want to do a UL where the class equals navbar nav. And again, these are all just sort of built-in functions within the Bootstrap navbar. And then I'm going to create my list elements within here. Let's say one's called home. maybe one is about us. Maybe another is favorites. And then let's call another like diagnosis. Okay. So you can see that it's sort of following the Navbar format. Now, there's a few things that I need to do, right? I haven't done my CSS for the Navbar. So I just sort of gave you the fillers, like Navbar brand, Navbar logo, Navbar nav. Now I actually have to write CSS for that. So for my Navbar, is it gray? Okay, whatever. So for my Navbar, I'm gonna give it a background color so that you can differentiate it. And then let's call it, how about tan? Okay. And then just to show that there's a sort of an outline, I'm gonna give it a box shadow. So with the box shadow, highlight this. Okay, so it says it attaches. This is a neat thing with Visual Studio Code, is it can sort of, if you highlight over something, tells you what you're dealing with. So attaches one or more drop shadows to the box. And the length of the shadow is essentially the different sides of my navbar. So I'm just gonna do a preset right here, and then close that out. And so now that I've reloaded this, now I have what kind of looks like a navbar, okay? Now my image, I think, is throwing everything off. So remember that I've called it navbar logo, but I haven't given that actually any formatting. So let's do that now. Navbar logo, and I just want to make it small. Height will just be 50 pixels. And then the width is going to be auto. Now, the reason we make the width auto is because I don't want to stretch it or distort it in any way. So I'm saying make the height 50 pixels, and then the width is just going to be whatever it ends up being at that height. So that's actually not quite small enough. I'm going to make it even smaller, about 30 pixels. Okay. So now we're almost there, but not quite. So going back to my code. Okay, what is wrong? So we have our navbar nav that is not quite aligning, right, with our navbar itself. So one way that we can make that work is, let's use display. I'm just going to close this other one so I don't get confused. So navbar nav display equals, how about inline? We might have to do the same thing with logo, but let's find out. Okay, so that didn't change anything. That didn't change anything either. Comment out that, so we can see that it's kind of working here. So we just have to figure out a way to make sure that these are on the same line and that they don't sort of knock each other to the next line. Sometimes the reason that we have to, the reason that there's a problem could be margin. So how about margin left equals 20 pixels. Okay, that didn't do it. So now what we're gonna try is okay. Display. I'm not sure why that part isn't working, but we can sort of get back to that later. In the meantime, just call our height of the navbar itself, maybe 100 pixels. And now it kind of at least looks acceptable, right? So another thing that we're going to need to do is I need to separate my different elements a little bit. So I'm actually going to, and this is a neat thing with Visual Studio Code. I'm highlighting my list element and I'm hitting Command or Control D, and it gives me 4 cursors. So now I can edit them all at once. So let's call this class navbar element. Okay. And then if I go back to base and create some CSS off of navbar element, and then we just say our margin left equals 12 pixels. There, now they're nicely spaced out. Maybe I actually want an upper one too. So margin all around is 12 pixels. Now they're spaced and they're separated from the KGI, right? Okay, another cool element of the Bootstrap navbar is it enables me to do drop downs. So let's see, what are my things? We have about us, favorites, diagnosis. Why don't we create a new list item? And we're gonna call it class, class equals drop down. So this will just use the Bootstrap styling. And now with this, we want to name it. How about identity? And actually, we're going to also have to give it the class navbar element because we want it to be nice and spaced out. So within identity, we can put another list, right? And then we can call this class's drop down menu. And then within that, we can call it patients, providers, payers. Okay, let's see how that looks. Okay, it doesn't work yet. Oh, and it's because I forgot to put identity. And these are all rules that you can find in the W3 Schools Bootstrap Navbar tutorial. But a class equals drop down toggle, data toggle equals drop down, and then we put identity within that. Okay. So now when I click that, it says patients, providers, payers, producers, right? Now it's a little funky. So I might need to actually add some styling to this as well, right? So how about navbar drop? And then here, I'm gonna say navbar drop, you know, one, oh, it actually looks like we got someone. Do we need to be concerned with CC images? What's that? Sorry, I know that's kind of an old question. I just noticed it. Okay, sounds like we're good.
Oh, I was just asking about copyright imaging.
Oh, no, don't worry about it for this, because we're not selling it. We're not really showing it to anyone outside of the class. So text decoration equals none. And then maybe we do like color equals black. Bar drop. Oh, sorry. I put this in the wrong place. Okay, so now it looks a little bit more similar. I could mess with it a little bit too to make it fit what's here. In fact, I wonder if I just call this navbar element. No, that doesn't fix my problems at all. So anyway, the purpose is to get this drop down, and then we can make it look neat later. So that's how you would do a navbar. The last thing I'll show you is I'm going to create a new file. So I'm going to call this, how about I'll save this as aboutus.html. And in here, I'm going to say, we are ALS414. Okay, so now this is in my code base. And then if I want to link to it, all I have to do, and let's have the about us link into it, is I create an A element, href, and then all I have to do is say about us.html. And I need to close this around the text. Then I click this and it says we are ALS414. So this is a good way to navigate away from my index into a new HTML. You can see that I just created an ahref element and I had that link to the name of my file. And the reason I don't have to say like images / about us is because I didn't put it in the images folder. I just put it in my home folder. If I were to put this index inside of, let's say, my videos, right? Now this should not work, right? In fact, I actually broke everything. So don't put index into there. But if I put about us into the videos, now index will work, but when I click about us, it fails. And the reason is because about us is now within the videos folder. So to change that, I would just say videos / about us. And then that works. We are ALS414. Okay. So you're basically just telling it where to go within your repository to find the folder, the HTML file that you want it to pull from. Same goes with referencing CSS files. Same goes with, JavaScript files. So it's a very important fact that a lot of people sometimes get wrong, where they might have it in a folder, but they'll try to reference it incorrectly. So it's very important that you make sure that everything is relative to index, and index is home. So if it's in the same folder as index, you just have to call out the name of the file. But if it's in a new one or a different folder, you have to do whatever that folder name is / the name of the file. Does that make sense? So I know it's quick, but you can kind of reference the code to see this is how you get Bootstrap. This is how you get JavaScript. This is how you reference new files within your repository so that people can work on a different file at the same time, not worry about stepping over each other's toes. And then before you know it, you're going to have a working app with multiple pages and different functions. So that's sort of the beginning of us learning how to code. Any questions?
Are you going to share your sample code? Because last week's YouTube video lecture recording, it was really hard to read. It was very pixelated.
Gotcha. Okay. I will share with you all the link to my GitHub. So right now this hasn't been pushed live, but I can just push it live right now. adding Navbar and bootstrap refs, right? Something like that. Push. And then the code should show up. You can see that it got reflected. I also have my new folder videos where I put that weird CSS file and my about us. Obviously my nomenclature is completely off. You should not put those things in a folder called video, but just sort of showing you what's possible. And then in here, I will just link my GitHub. So now you have access to my code. I just put in the chat. And then I'll also put the link to my GitHub in an announcement where I link the YouTube video. Okay. All right. Well, you're free to go. I'll stick around if anyone has any questions.
Will, just wondering.
Sure.
How, so I guess, because I just saw you had to do a lot of trial and error right there. I was wondering if there's, I thought the Bootstrap, because I know the Bootstrap has templates in there, and I downloaded it. It's basically some of them have CSS files, some of them have JavaScript files, and HTML files. Do you want us to do that, or do you want us to just code from scratch?
It's okay for you to use templates. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay.
So you could take something that works and then just change the headers to what you want them to be.
Okay, and I see it is available in bootstrap.com, like their actual website. And that's a good way to look for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll send a link in the announcement as well that shows you how to navigate all the Bootstrap stuff, because a lot of it is just sort of referencing the documentation.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because some other group was asking me like, how are they going to finish this in like 3 weeks? Yeah, without programming experience. But it looks like Bootstrap's the way to go.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.